Welcome to the Green Transition Show. I'm Dr. Francis Tuokun. This platform is dedicated to unpacking the most pressing issues shaping our planet, from climate policy to sustainable development and energy transitions. Today, we are diving into climate change adaptation, not just how we respond to climate impacts, but how we build resilience into our systems, institutions, and communities. Joining me to discuss these issues is Dr. Saleem Khan. Before we begin, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. Your support helps us to continue bringing you insightful, thoughtful, and evidence-based conversations on climate and sustainability. Doc, welcome to the show.
Very good morning, Professor Francis. Thank you for having me here. And I'm glad that I'm part of this great show on the green transition.
Doc, can you please introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
Sure, Professor Francis. This is Saleem Khan. I'm a certified climate resilient officer and also a researcher in climate adaptation. I hold my PhD in climate adaptation science and also accomplished my Fulbright postdoctoral fellowship in climate policy and governance from the Earth Institute, Columbia University. I also served as a senior climate adaptation officer with the Global Green Growth Institute, which is GGGI, an treaty-based intergovernmental organization that supports countries in making and developing climate policies. And I also have the privilege to support the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, MOCAI, government of the UAE, in developing the National Adaptation Plan, which is and that's a short introduction from my end, Professor Francis.
Yeah, thanks for that wonderful introduction. Many people have been confused about some of the terminologies used in climate change. Sometimes it's difficult to differentiate between what is climate mitigation and what is climate adaptation. Can you differentiate between the two? Can you tell us what is climate mitigation and what is climate adaptation?
Definitely, Professor Francis. It's very good to start with the definition so that we can understand some of the very basic element on the climate purview. If you take the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its 6th assessment report, that was a recent one, it defines adaptation as the process of adjustment to actual or expected climate and its effect in order to moderate harm or exploit beneficial opportunities. If we take this definition, it says the very fact that the climate change is happening and we need to adjust. So put it in a simple term, what adaptation refers to, which is nothing but an ability to adjust. Now, here the key word is to adjust. I'll give some examples. What are this climate adaptation? For example, if you take nature-based solutions, restoring wetlands, creating a natural buffer against storm surges, or even in the agricultural area, drought-resistant crops or infrastructure buildings, which has the resilient to withstand different climate calamities. If you also refer the same IPCC for the definition of mitigation, it defines mitigation as an anthropogenic intervention to reduce the sources or enhance the sink of greenhouse gases. To put it simple, mitigation is nothing but a method or a process to stop or to control the greenhouse gas emission. Now, there are two distinct examples or definition. One is adaptation is ability to adjust. Mitigation is method or step to control or stop the emission of greenhouse gas emission. For example, in mitigation, some example like energy transition, that is a one prospective step that we take forward to reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. And if you take, there are a number of industrial improvement in their operations, how best we can reduce the emission of greenhouse gases. So these are a very simple way to understand what is adaptation and what is mitigation. I hope this helps, Professor Francis.
Getting right? Are we getting the adaptation right or mitigation right in terms of the global community? Which one are we doing right in terms of dealing with our climate problem?
There is no question on is this right or wrong. Yes, both are equally important, but mitigation taking more momentum because it can be measured. For example, if you take how much amount of greenhouse gas you're emitting, there are ways that you can measure the emission of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So it is measurable. Whereas adaptation, it is not that easy to measure because the benefits of adaptation differs. That's one way. And two, mitigation, you can see the results in front of you. Adaptation, yes, it will happen, but it will take time. So when we plan for mitigation, many of the private entities or even the government or even the public, they want to have the difference right in front of you, which mitigation can answer. Adaptation, it will happen, but it will take time. So are we doing right in either adaptation or mitigation? Yes, we are doing both, but mitigation going frontline because of these reasons. Adaptation is little behind, but now adaptation is also gaining momentum in the global climate negotiations, and countries started working on to invest heavily on adaptation as the impact is going to be much more heavier.
Why is adaptation becoming more urgent globally?
That's a brilliant question because adaptation becoming more urgent for a reason the climate impacts are accelerating or increasing faster than what previously projected. We have almost 6 assessment report from the IPCC. If you see the climate projections with now they are coming up with more confidence and they are with more certainty. They are telling that the amount of greenhouse gases increase will have a significant impact. Now that here the key word is the impact. So the impact is already started felt across the globe, and the impact is very devastating. That is one of the key reasons where the global community started thinking about it is not just mitigation, but also we need to address adaptation. The economic cost is heavily. For example, we have here an unprecedented rainfalls, which gives big storm surges, or along with the coastal sea level rise. That has a heavy impact on the coastal community. This is just one example. Likewise, we have many other in the mountain area, in the desert area. The extreme change in climate has a severe impact. So it is not just calculating and accounting carbon in the atmosphere, but also its impact on the ground, the people, the ecosystem that has been heavily impacted. And that is the reason this adaptation is gaining momentum now globally, considered as an urgent issue that we need to respond.
And we are told in our everyday conversations about climate change that there are some regions that are more vulnerable than other regions. Which are those regions that are more vulnerable, and why are they more vulnerable?
Again, that is very interesting question. Now, before we get into which regions are more vulnerable, it would be best we understand what is vulnerabilities mean. Vulnerability, according to the IPCC, is refers based on the exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. In a simple equation, vulnerability is equal to exposure plus sensitivity plus adaptive capacity. So all these factors put together that determines vulnerability of a person, of a system, or of an ecosystem, or a region, you put it anywhere. Now, if there is an impact, the vulnerability across the globe, of course it's happening, but the degree of vulnerability differs. I'll give you an example. If you take a coastal area, let us take the UAE coast. the impact of sea level definitely is going to have a big impact on the ground, but may not be all the coastal area across the UAE will be vulnerable. The low-lying area will be more vulnerable than the upland. So this is one example. We are in the same coast. If there is a sea level increase, the impact will be more heavier on part A than part B. The part A may be due to one of the reason low-lying area. This is geographical setting. As I said, vulnerability also based on the adaptive capacity. For example, I and my neighbor living close by to each other on the coastal area, and there is a sea level rise, whereas I am heavily impacted than my neighbor.
Yeah.
Maybe due to the reason I live in a small hut. My neighbor lives in a well-raised apartment. So the impact immediately felt by me, not by him. I may not have a medical insurance or life insurance. My uh, neighbor would have carried that such an insurance so that he can able to face if there is any impact, any loss, then he can able to face such a loss through his insurance. Even education, I have more capacity or less capacity to understand and get prepared, whereas my neighbor has a good education or even good awareness, he may is able to get more strength to face it. So the vulnerability, it depends on geographical setting. It depends on the exposure. It depends on the adaptive capacity. But if you take globally, how these regions are vulnerable, you take small island states. For them, if you take Papua New Guinea, or if you take Fiji or Solomon Islands, the threat for them is mainly due to rising sea level. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa, there the threat or vulnerability is determined based on the high dependence on the rain-fed agriculture. If there is an erratic rainfall, then there is a significant impact on the sub-Saharan. For example, even in the Middle East, Africa region, the MENA region, increasing heat extremes, the water scarcity, particularly the urban heat island, like big cities like Dubai, they are drastically growing. Meanwhile, the vulnerability to the climate impact also changes, and here it refers to urban heat island. So it may be very difficult to pinpoint one particular area across the globe. This is vulnerable. So the vulnerability is spread across the globe, but the degree of vulnerability differs pertaining to the geographical setting, as I mentioned, the adaptive capacity, exposure, and sensitivity.
So, based on your expert opinion, do you think we are currently adapting fast enough?
The honest answer is no, but it doesn't mean that we have done nothing. But the graph shows, what is the graph in the UNFCCC negotiations? If you see the graph of adaptation discussion, adaptation policies, adaptation planning, adaptation investment and finance, it is greatly growing high, which means we started talking more about adaptation. We started working more towards adaptation. If you see the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report 2025, it estimates the cost of adaptation finance that is needed, particularly in the developing countries, is putting around, it is just an estimate. It says about US dollar 310 billion per year in 2035. 10 years before, we don't even have this number. But now we have this number. Now, Adaptation Gap Report in particular, they are constantly releasing this report every alternate years, 2023, 2025. This number gives us an alarm where all other countries started working on not just mitigation, but also adaptation. One, the threat, another, the financial cost required. I'll give one good example answering to your question. Are we currently adapting fast enough? Yes. First I said no, but now I'm telling yes, because after this last 5 years of assessment, many countries started preparing their national adaptation plan. According to UNFCCC, 15th of January, 75 countries has submitted the National Adaptation Plan. That itself is a big milestone in adaptation to assess where we are, what are our threats and impact, and how best we need to address it. It is not just an oral statement, it is a scientific evidence that help us to plan. And many countries started implementing their adaptation plans. Many countries, we can cite many. And even the UAE, they started preparing their own national adaptation plan at the federal level, including both sectoral as well as the emirate level, which is the subnational level, which we say horizontal and vertical integration. So this adaptation planning give a guideline for each country how best we can move forward. So are we currently adapting fast enough? We are doing it, which is good sign, but we need to move much fast, much more speed. And we are doing it. I have that hope, and we will much more move forward on this context.
Viewers and listeners, if you are finding this conversation insightful, make sure to subscribe to the Green Transition Show so you don't miss future conversations with leading thinkers shaping the global green transition. With me this afternoon to have this wonderful conversation is Dr. Saleem Khan. Doc, what does successful adaptation look like in practice? We're talking about all these theories in our conversations, but what does successful adaptation look like in practice?
That is very tricky question, but it's very interesting for a researcher like me. I would like to split the question into two. What is successful adaptation as one, and how it has practical implication? How successful on practice? Now, successful adaptation, it depends on you make a plan which is anticipatory. That's what the climate projection tells 2040, 2050. There will be a 0.5 meter of sea level. There will be 1 degree rise of temperature. You have that projection and you plan according to that projection, which we say a planned adaptation or anticipatory adaptation, not just reactive, meaning you have this impact, then you react. Now, the adaptation should be planned or anticipatory. Two, it should be inclusive and equitable. That is very important aspects. If you see all the NAP in particular, gender and social inclusion plays a big role. It is leaving no one behind, including everyone in this adaptation plan, which requires meticulous approach, identifying vulnerable communities, all the stakeholders, involving them in the adaptation initiative. So the point two is inclusive and equitable. Third, it should be of the integrated planning, because we already have number of developmental plans for each country, for each subnational emirate or a state or a province plan. But the adaptation should go hand in hand. We say mainstreaming adaptation with the developmental plan, so that we have no regret factor later. For example, you have a developmental plan for a city, and you integrate adaptation or mainstream adaptation with this developmental plan. But there may be a question. Science always comes with a question. What if there is no sea level rise in 2050 as expected? Because there is always an uncertainty and we cannot challenge nature. Our best human science says there will be an increase. In case if there is no increase, then there is a question, then why we want to invest in adaptation now? Then the money will go waste. To address that one, it's better to mainstream with the existing developmental policies, so that even if you invest and it does not have a direct benefit to address the sea level rise, still it supports the other ancillary response measures or the developmental activities of the country. Mangrove plantation is one such an example. For example, the science says 0.5 meter sea level rise 2050, you plant a mangrove. But there is a question, what if there is no sea level rise? That uncertainty factor. Even if there is no sea level rise, still you plant mangrove, it helps the fishing community. It helps the ecosystem to be in a very good environment. no matter whether sea level rise happens or not happens. The third point, as I mentioned, to integrate into the developmental planning. And fourth is evidence-based. This is what very crucial for a scientist, for a researcher. We need to have an evidence, meaning the best climate model projects the future sea level rise projection. We have best impact and vulnerability assessment tools and techniques to identify areas that are highly vulnerable low. Now, why this is important? There is something called maladaptation. You invest like $5 million in a particular area in the coastal system, naming to adapt. But if you have not done your evidences-based assessment, which is impact and vulnerability, instead of investing $5 million in part A, you go and invest in part B, which is a wrong investment. Both are in the same coast, but one area is not vulnerable, another area is vulnerable. Unless you know which is vulnerable or not, it's not going to worth it. So it should be evidence-based. All the above, it should be in such a way we reduce the vulnerability, which is measurable. So adaptation is nothing but, I said, ability to adjust. Now, how that happens? Only if you reduce the vulnerability.
Yeah.
So this is how we, as a researcher, give the criteria or indicators for successful adaptation: anticipatory, inclusive, integrated into developmental planning, evidence-based, and reducing vulnerability, which is measurable. Now, I'll go to the second part of your question, how practically it is possible and what are those characteristics. We can measure the success of adaptation on practical by number of ways. One example is reducing the disaster mortality is one such an example. For example, if you go for a loss and damage, when there is an impact of climate, the very first thing that we do is what is the loss and damage. If that estimates gives you a good number, then it is a good indicator that this adaptation measure that we have implemented on ground, which is practically implemented, it shows its own benefits. If there are no mangroves and there is a sea level rise, there are casualties of 100 people dying to the rising sea level or a coastal flood. There is another area with mangroves and the casualty of death, mortality due to rising sea level or a coastal flooding is just 20. Then that is the difference. Investing more in mangrove region help us to protect the coastal community. So that is one on reducing the mortality. Two, practically possible, another thing is climate resilient infrastructure. I'm sure, Professor, you're coming from the energy background. You know how efficient these infrastructures today we are going towards, which are much more climate resilient. I give more example on sea level rise because that's where I come from. My expertise is on, and I also believe that is easy to understand. There is a coastal area and we put a sea wall. So that is one of an example of a climate resilient infrastructure. You have an apartment earlier in with the ground floor. Now there is a threat of sea level rise. Now either you elevate your apartment to a higher level, the new upcoming apartment, or the existing apartment you evacuate, or there is no occupation, you're not occupying that area. It is just a garage or a car park. You change that place so that you can make your system a little more resilient to sea level. So climate resilient infrastructure is second. And third is the diversified livelihood. So there are people, there are communities mostly depend on the ecosystem for their livelihood. That should be diversified so that they don't depend on one particular resource. And fourth, on the functional early warning system. That is very essential, and that helps us to prepare in advance. As I mentioned, the anticipatory, the early warning plays a big role. Many countries has witnessed that early warning system is greatly help in people to face the disaster, which was short term, and the impact of climate change, which is the long term. So that helps us. And very importantly, the climate proofed policies. Policies are the key, the regulations are very, very vital. That should help us, guide us, and also for us to react to these kind of challenges. I'll give just a couple of examples to put both successful adaptation and adaptation practically successful as well.
Yes, particularly, I'll be happy if you can give us examples from the local level, right?
Exactly.
Local examples.
Sure. So if you take Netherlands, in Netherlands, the Dutch Delta program that integrate sea level rise projection into their spatial planning, that helps for their infrastructure investment. This is, your spatial plan, and that spatial plan spells out this is a vulnerable area. This is not a vulnerable area. Now that is one stand. Another, you take that plan and go to the infrastructure department so that they don't go and construct in the vulnerable land any heavy infrastructures, the government one or even a private one. They know there is a threat. For example, I know that area is going to sink. Do I buy a plot over there, build an apartment over there? Definitely not. So the Dutch program on the Netherlands is one of the examples on spatial planning. If you go to Bangladesh, they have a wonderful farming system is called floating agriculture. Now, what is that? They know there will be a sea level rise, and there are people living on that coast or in the backwaters. For example, you take mangroves in Bangladesh, they have a big, wonderful Sundarbans, and they have the mangroves in the backwaters. And science telling sea level rise will impact on mangroves. Okay. But the community are not ready to go out from the place. They are asked us the question, because I have a personal experience. When we recommend them to move away from the place, they ask the question to us, do you vacate your home? Do you come out from your villa or an apartment? I said, no, because that's my home. Same answer they said, no, I cannot come. Even if it is sea level rise, I still be there because it's my land. But again, science cannot just leave it, or the government cannot just leave it. We need to find alternative ways. We tried to convince them, but they couldn't. Then they came up with a new technique called floating agriculture. So the farmer knows that particular land is going to sink, is already sinking, in fact. So he introduced a new technique called floating agriculture. You take the bamboo sticks and build a structure and allow the plants to grow that can grow in the water. So he still survived in that same place, and he meets the challenge. So that is another example, the practical or local level example, Bangladesh floating agriculture. Policy level, again, even in the UAE, the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, MOCAI, has integrated climate risk information across different sectors like public health, infrastructure, energy, and then environment and insurance, if I'm not wrong. All these plans, when you include the climate risk assessment into the sectoral planning, big cities like Dubai, Abu Dhabi are able to come forward and make their own emirate level adaptation planning that helps to mitigate the heat or even to come up with a nature-based solution. See, these are some of the local level examples from Netherlands, Dutch program, via to Bangladesh, floating agriculture, to climate risk integration and sectoral adaptation planning in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, or some of the examples. I can give many more if you have give me an opportunity to discuss with more time.
Okay, so related to the examples you've just cited, I would want to find out from you what role does indigenous knowledge play in adaptation?
Wonderful. Indigenous knowledge is the one of the main pillars in adaptation planning. In other words, we say community-based adaptation, CBA. Earlier, like we just spelled out ecosystem-based adaptation. Then we have introduced along with that community-based adaptation. Now we are much refined the terms into a nature-based solution, which is a combination of both ecosystem and community. Now, indigenous in particular refers to a cumulative and a place-based knowledge system. That is very, very vital, because like you the science and technology do all the wonderful inventions and findings and come up with even solutions. But when you practically implement on ground, not everything goes 100% successful because science may not know or the technology may not know what is practically happening on ground unless you go and experiment it on ground. And that's where we need to bring the local communities or local knowledge system into the integration planning. I'll give one example from the desert region. The Bedouin tents we have in the Middle Eastern region, they have a tent called Bedouins, which is a traditional Bedouin tents that were designed for mobility, ventilation, thermal comfort, and even to withstand the harsh environment of the desert. This is just the traditional knowledge. Now, this
Yeah.
helps today. We put it in the name of adaptation or a resilient, how best we can have this kind of a system in the desert region to adapt so that we may able to face the harsh environment in the desert. It may be extreme heat or extreme cold. It is not today we are talking about adaptation. This is there in this region or any region age old. If you go to their history 100 years back, they have the Bedouin tent. Today we are talking about energy efficient building. It's all there already. If we did not acknowledge, then it is our model may not be 100% successful. So it is always wise to bring those um, knowledge that comes from the ground so that it has its own roots and also it can withstand for the long. I can give another example on the passive cooling architecture, which we say the wind towers. In the UAE or in many of the Middle Eastern countries, they have uh, native wind towers. It's called Barjil, if I spell correctly. So that wind tower helps us to, that is a kind of a cooling technology. That wind tower helps to keep the area cool by that moves along with the wind direction. Today, we are talking about global cooling and cooling systems. We are coming up with so many low carbon and climate responsive innovations. It's good. But if we go back to the knowledge of the indigenous community, the local level, so that these structures, our invention can be much more stronger. It can withstand in that particular region for a long. That is our observation in our adaptation when we did so many science-based evidences and projections with the climate model. But it all we take to the ground to a fishing community, to a farmer community, explain to them, and they will just say, oh, we have done this 50 years before. Good. Let us know that so that we integrate that with our technology so that it can become much more efficient. I hope I answered your question, Professor.
Yes, yes, you did. Thanks so much. Viewers, this is the Green Transition Show, a platform dedicated to unpacking the most pressing issues, particularly at this time of our history, where climate change is a threat to food security and the well-being of our planet. Kindly subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share with your friends and colleagues. Doc, we started this conversation with a distinction between climate mitigation and climate adaptation. Over the years, we've seen that more funding usually um, goes to climate mitigation efforts. So, meaning that climate adaptation is lagging in terms of funding. Why is it the case?
That is a very needed question that we need to look into this aspect because end of the day, it is the finance, the budget, the money that makes all the difference. As I quoted earlier, the adaptation gap report by the UNEP, it clearly estimates that uh, compare to the mitigation efforts financially, the adaptation are much behind. The estimates require states uh, if you see adaptation gap report 2023 and 2025, it started from 215 billion by 2030. Now the estimates showing much more increased number to 365 billion here, approximate ranges, which is a clear indication that we require the money. Now the valid question is why there is an imbalance. Again, as I pointed earlier in my conversation, the mitigation generate revenue. For example, the renewable energy project generate financial returns. You're an energy expert. When you make a plan, it addresses mitigation, but in turn, it gives you a financial return. Whereas adaptation project often produce only the public goods, flood protection. It will not give you in return in terms of money. It gives its return in different other form, like it saves the life. It protects the environment. So that could be one of the reasons why there is an imbalance. When the private sector wants to invest the money, they always wants to know what is the return. So adaptation in this case, we cannot reap it immediately, that too in the form of money. Two, the measurement challenges. Mitigation, comparatively, it is easier to measure the tons of carbon dioxide that has been reduced. That is one example. Whereas in adaptation, the outcomes are harder to quantify. Yes, the COP30, which recently held in Belém, Brazil, the global goal on adaptation came up with a set of indicators, how best we can address adaptation, which also include the measurements on different sectors. So these indicate the evolving area in the adaptation science help us to move much more faster in addressing these things, unless like mitigation, because mitigation, at least 5-10 years before itself, we know how to measure carbon dioxide. Now today, only last 3 to 4 years, we started thinking about how to measure adaptation. And these indicators are now coming up, help us to understand how we can measure adaptation. And third, as I mentioned, the private sector preferences. Usually the private sector prefer mitigation so that it helps us them to predict a tangible cash flow. End of the day, the point is to make money for them. And also importantly, the political stability. That is very important. At least in the case of adaptation, this is very important because the solar farms, the drainage system, these are not politically visible, These are more of a country planning of the planning level. The mitigation is talked at the global level, carbon emission. Do the drainage system talked about it, the flooding? No. Today we are talking. Now it is the importance of adaptation make us to talk these things in the global negotiation. Earlier, it was only mitigation. It is only the industry emitting carbon. And nobody talked about solid waste management. Nobody give much attention to a drainage flooding system in the global negotiation. But today, the prime ministers and the presidents and the head of the states, they understood the value of a drainage system. What will happen if there is a flood in a city? Because at the end of the day, they need to answer to the people. So now they understood the importance. So maybe political visibility could be one of the reasons for this imbalance. And also, like, all the countries now gearing up towards adaptation because the capacity building is quietly increasing. The point I'm trying to emphasize is the knowledge, the awareness, the capacity building. Compared to mitigation, adaptation is now only booming up. I'm so glad today Green Transition Show took its first pitch in the name of climate adaptation, and I see this is our success. Our first topic, you've given a priority to adaptation, and now we are gaining momentum. Adaptation is gaining momentum, and that is the awareness, and that is the need, and that is the capacity building that we are talking about. And thank you so much to you and your team for giving importance. And we are the advocate of adaptations. That is our job. And we are so happy you're coming up with this topic in Green Transition Show. That is beautiful. And we are trying to scale up at a different level, from the community to academia, to a research, to a policy planner, to a decision maker, or even to a supreme level of any country. So these imbalances help mitigation to move forward much more easier than adaptation. but adaptation is no way behind. We are running the race much more faster, Professor.
Yeah, thank you. We are so happy to have you on the show. You are our first guest, and that shows how we prioritize climate change issues, particularly climate adaptation. So, what are your final words? We've been having insightful discussions for the past minutes, almost an hour now. What are your final words for us?
Definitely. Uh, Adaptation is not new. If you take Charles Darwin, the father of evolution, even in his book, The Origin of Species, he have made a quote where he talks about no living thing can survive if it does not having any ability to adjust. The organism that has the potential or ability to adjust only can survive. That is the survival theory. And that is what today IPCC and climate adaptation professionals like me are advocating for adaptation. Adaptation is nothing but ability to adjust, and it is not something new. It is there with us, but we need to enhance it. If mitigation is about securing the future climate, whereas adaptation is about protecting people today. Both are equally important. There is no different weightage for these two. Both are equally important. But adaptation is fundamentally about resilience, justice, and survival.
If this discussion If this discussion helps you understand climate adaptation in a deeper way, please like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends. We bring you evidence-based conversations with global experts shaping climate, energy, and sustainable policy. We thank our guests for joining us and sharing such valuable insights. And thank you all for tuning in and engaging with these important issues. We look forward to seeing you in our next episode next week. Until then, goodbye for now.
Thank you.